Welcome back everybody to Simple Trader. So recently, or so far, we've done a lot of work in our domain specifically, such as getting the top major indexes and allowing accounts to buy stocks. But what we haven't done is actually set up those accounts. So what I'm going to do in this episode is actually take a step back from our specific domain stuff, and we're going to add user authentication such as registration and logging in. And I usually save this for later in the project, but I think now's a good time since that buy service we implemented explicitly uses an account. So it would be nice to actually let users create their accounts at this time. Now before we do that, I have this user domain object as we recall, and on here I have a property called password. Now I actually want to change this to password a hash because part of our authentication is we are going to be hashing passwords in the database, not storing them as plain text. We're going to be doing this securely, so we're going to change this to password hash, and then we also need to update our database as well. So we're going to add a migration here, and we'll call this password hash, and I need to set this as my starter project. So set your entity framework project as the startup since that's where our design reference is, and now this should all work out. Oh, and this needs to be entity framework as well for your default project right here. I always mess this up. There we go. So we got that migration, and now just an update database. And there we go. Now we're good to go. Okay. So now to make this authentication service, I've actually set up a Visio diagram, so let me bring that up real quick. Let's do a little bit of a split screen here. And right here I have this authentication service. Let me zoom in on that. Move the server. So authentication service is going to have two methods, register and login, of course. Register is basically just going to take all the information that a user's account will have, such as the email, username, and then the password, and a confirm password field as well, so we can make sure that they really want that password. And then we're also going to have a login method that'll just take the username and password. So as you can tell, this username is going to have to be unique. We cannot have users with the same username. So let's go ahead and create the service. We're going to create a new item in our domain layer, and it's going to be the interface for this service. IAccountService. And we're going to make that public and just put down these two methods that we want this interface to have. So this is going to be, again, a task, so we can call it asynchronously, and it's going to return a boolean. So basically a true false, you either register or you don't register. Or actually, I think these return types are subject to change. I'm actually going to return just, I think we'll leave it as a bool for now, but they are subject to change because we do want some kind of result if you try to register with the same username. There's a lot of talk out there like, should you throw exceptions? Should you return a result object? I'm kind of leaning on returning a result, or throwing exceptions actually, so I'm not entirely sure yet. So for now we're just going to return a boolean for true false. So this will be register, and it's going to take a string for the email, username, password, which is a string, and confirm password. And then after that we're also going to have another method for logging in, and this is going to return the logged in account for the user's credentials. So we'll call this login, and again, username and password. Unique username. So now we have this service, we should be good there, and we are actually going to implement this IAccountService service in our domain layer. So actually, I'm going to create a folder here, and I'm going to call this Authentication Services. And then we're actually going to move this inside of here. And then, let me bring that up again, change this namespace. Authentication Services. I'm struggling with spelling Authentication Service. I know how to spell it, but I don't trust my fingers sometimes. Okay. Now we're going to implement that service inside of our domain layer actually. which might be a little bit surprising because we expect this to use the database, but I'm pretty confident we can just keep everything in our domain layer and use some of the services that we have defined in our Entity Framework project, but use them through their interfaces. So we can just depend on IAccountService and all that. So this is just going to be the Authentication Service, and it's going to implement that interface. So let's go ahead and do that. And make these async real quick. And while we're at it, let's go ahead and close out of this Visio. We should be good there for now. Then we can go full screen and implement these methods. So the first method I'm actually going to implement is this register method. So let's go ahead and do that. So inside these parameters we get all the information we want for a new user. So let's go ahead and create that user. And we'll call this, let's call it user. And set all those properties. So we have an email. That'll be the user's email that we get from the method. Username, same thing. And then we also have password hash. So we're going to have to hash this password. So we're going to have to do that up here. And to hash passwords, I'm actually going to use the password hasher that's provided in ASP.NET. So if we do, I believe it's an iPassword hasher, and we'll just call this hasher, and then create that new password hasher like that. And then we can control dot on this. As you can see, we can install some packages here. We're actually going to install the ASP.NET identity.core. So let's go ahead and do that. And then we get to use this password hasher. And the reason we're doing this instead of creating our own hasher is that, well, this is a lot quicker. We shouldn't be reinventing the wheel just to hash a password. And it is a Microsoft class right here, so it's probably pretty trustworthy. I've actually done some research. I forget what algorithm it uses, but we are going to be using this to hash our passwords. So now let's use that hasher to hash a password. And that password we're going to hash is just the password we get from the register method. Now, one thing to do before we get into all this, we should probably make sure that these passwords match. So hopefully our UI will do that as well, and this will just be a second check, but we'll also check it here. So if password equals confirm password, then we'll do all this. And I should also create a success flag that we will return at the end of the method. So right now it's false, and we'll just return that once we're all done here. So now we've hashed our password. We should actually put that into a string so we can use it. We'll call it hashed password, and then we can set that on our user. And there we go. Now, of course, a user also has an account. So we're actually going to insert the account into the database, not the user. But our account that we insert is going to have the user attached to it. So when we insert the account, it'll create the user as well. So let's create that account. And then all we need on here is the account holder, which is, again, the user object. So we can just set that like that. And I think that's actually all we need on the account. Is there any other balance? I mean, I guess we could, for testing, just give an initial balance, but we're not going to do that. That should be always set. So now we've created our account that has a new user, and now we need to insert this new account into the database. And to do that, we are going to use an IAccountService for accounts, so we can call this create method. So we're going to have to get that through our constructor. So let's create a field for that right here, an IAccountService of accounts, and we'll call it AccountService. And let's get that through the constructor, so I'll highlight that and generate that constructor. And there we go. We got our account service, and now we can use it. So we'll say AccountService.create, and we'll just give it the account. and then we got to await that as well. And it also returns a new account, but we don't have to really do anything with that right now because we're not giving back an account at the end of this method. So we're just going to call this and not take a look at the result. Now keep in mind there's still a few more things that we have to do with this method, such as check if the username doesn't already exist in the database. We'll probably also check if the email already exists because I don't want to duplicate that as well. And then I think we are actually going to throw exceptions to handle those cases. Now before we get into that, let's actually test out this method. So let's go into our app.xaml.cs right where our application starts up, and let's create a new IAuthentication service. Maybe we should just register this with our dependency injection real quick. Let's do that because we're going to have to eventually anyways. So right down here, or right up here, we'll do IAuthentication Service, and it'll just be an authentication service. And let's import all that. So now up here, now that we've registered it, we can get it from our service provider. So let's do that. It's nice having this dependency injection container actually. And let's get that service. And now let's try out a registration. So I'm going to register test@gmail.com. We'll do Singleton Sean. Password will be test123 and test123. And let's actually bring up our database real quick. Let's see, do we actually have data in here? We do. I can leave that, okay. But anyways, let's run this and see if we successfully register. We have to switch our startup project back to WPF because you cannot run a class library, of course. Okay, so we start up. Let's go take a look at our database. Refresh that. And then there we go. We got our new user. As you can see, we get the password hash. And there's also this date join that we forgot to set. So let's go ahead and set that. I believe, is that on our user? Date joined, okay, so that'll be datetime.now. Perfect, okay. So we don't have to test that again. Pretty straightforward. So now I feel pretty good about this registration method so far. Again, email, username, we're going to have to check those and make sure that they don't already exist in the database. But let's go ahead and create our login method next. So this method is actually going to be a little bit different. So what I want to do first is get an account from the database based on this username, and then I'll also hash this password that gets passed in by the user and compare it to the account's password, and if they match, then we're going to return the account, which will mean that the login was successful. So what we really need is a getByUsername method on our IDataService for account. But let's take a look at this. All we have on here is a getByID. So we're going to have to create a custom service for account so that we can do a getByUsername. And I think we're also going to have to do a getByEmail too to make sure that we're not duplicating emails in the database. So let's go ahead and we're going to need a new service for this. So let's create that new service. First we're going to create the interface in our domain layer, and this is going to be the IAccountService. And we'll make that public, and it's actually going to have all of the same methods as our IDataService for accounts, so all the CRUD stuff, but it's going to have additional methods too. So we're going to have that getByUsername, and we're also going to have a getByEmail as well. And obviously we're going to have to take in those parameters through these methods. Let's import task, and that's all for that interface. So now back in our authentication service, instead of an IDataService for accounts, this needs to be an IAccountService. Like that. And now, of course, we haven't implemented this yet. Let's update this constructor real quick. but I'm going to use it in this login method, assuming that I have it implemented, and we'll go back and do that once we're done with these methods. So first thing we want to do is get the stored account, and to do that we're going to use our account service and get by username. And now that we have that account, what we are going to do is make sure the account that's stored, make sure that password on that account matches the password that the user has given to this login method. So to do that, we are going to use our password hasher again. So not only does this hash passwords, but if you take a look at this, it verifies hashed passwords as well. So we are going to use a password hasher, and before I do that, let's actually just move this into a field up here so we don't have to create a new instance in our login method. So we're going to call this the password hasher, and then we won't have to create a new instance every single time we register and every single time we log in. So let's get rid of that. Use our password hasher, and then we're also going to have to instantiate it as well. And down the road I might actually pass this, I think we might actually just pass this through the constructor, because down the road we might change it. And then all we'd have to do is change out the implementation of this interface. So we got our password hasher figured out. So all we want to do here is we'll create a boolean passwords match, and we'll use our password hasher and verify a hash password. So the first parameter of this is the hashed password, and that is on our stored account in the account holder and password hash. There we go. And the provided password is what we get from the method, so we'll just pass that in right here. And this returns a password verification result. So let's grab that, and we'll change this to password result. And now that we got that result, let's take a look at what it says. So we want to make sure it's successful. I think that is, alright, there we go, success. So if the password matches, then we're actually just going to return the stored account. Or actually, let's return this at the end of the method. And if the password is not successful, then we're going to throw an exception. And I think we're going to create a custom exception for this down the road. Again, a lot of talk between throwing exceptions and returning result objects, but in this case I really want to throw exceptions, I think. So now we have this method. Let's go ahead and test this in our app.xaml, but actually, caught myself right there. Before we test that, we need to implement this IAccountService, and that is going to go inside of our Entity Framework project. So we already have the account data service, but let's change this to an IAccountService. And it's okay to change that because, as we recall, the IAccountService implements iDataService as well. So anybody that is using the account data service as an iDataService, that interface is still going to be satisfied. And now we're going to have to create those new methods. So let's implement those. So get by email. Let's go ahead and copy this. I'm really just copying it for the using statement. I don't feel like typing it out. And what we're going to do is return. Let's look at our accounts. And we are going to include the account's user. So if we take a look at the account, we need to include account holder, that navigation property, so that we can read the password hash and all the data on the account's user object. And then the account that we're going to return is the first account, where the account holder's email equals the email that we are looking for. And let's go ahead and make this async, and await. So that's our get by email, and actually I'm going to copy this because our get by username is going to be very similar. So instead, let's make this async. We're going to be checking the username like that. And looking at these get methods I have, our get by ID and our get all don't actually include the user account. So let's go ahead and add that. I like to do my links like one statement on each line as well. So let's add on these the account holder like that. Let's get these on their own lines. And we can just copy that statement and move that up here. And while we're at it, we should also get the asset transactions when we get by email and get by username. Like that. And that should return all of the fulfilled navigation properties with our account. So now we have that service figured out, and now we need to go back into our dependency injection container and fix up those services. So instead of our iData service for accounts being an account data service, we are actually going to leave that, I think. But we're also going to register an account data service as an IAccountService as well. Like that. And then as we recall, our authentication service needs a password hasher. So let's go ahead and register that. We'll register it in its own little section because it's not really our service. So we're going to register a password hasher. Import that. And it's just going to be the default password hasher. Like that, okay. And I think that should be everything that we need. So let's go ahead and try this out. Back in our app.xaml, we get our authentication service, but now we're going to log in. It's not spelled right. Log in. And our login takes our username and password, so we can get rid of the email field and the confirm password field. And then let's take a look at the result that we get back. Actually, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to go straight into our authentication service and make sure we hit this, because I don't feel like making this async and all that. So we log in, our password verification was successful, and then we get the stored account. Let's look at those navigation properties. We get the asset transactions, which we have none, of course, and an account holder. And as you can see, hash password, all good. And there's our email as well. So that is basically the functionality for these methods, but we're going to have to clean this up a little bit and throw some better exceptions. And also we need to implement some code here to make sure that we don't insert a user that already exists. So actually the first thing I want to do is switch this up a little bit and do the password confirmation up here. And if it fails, I'll throw the exception, and then we'll keep on going if it doesn't. So this is just like a little bit of a restructuring that we're doing. So we're going to throw an exception here, and I haven't created that exception yet, but I want to show all the exceptions that we will be throwing first. So another thing we need to do is get the user by email. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll call this email user equals, we'll use our account service and get by email. And then basically, if this email user is null, or if it's not null, that means that a user already exists in our database with the email that we're trying to register with. So that means that we will not create the account. We're going to throw an exception here. And of course this returns an account, not a user. So we'll make this email account. So let's just have a little placeholder right there, throw a new exception. And now we're going to also copy this, and we're going to get an account by username here to make sure that we don't duplicate the username. like that. So if username account does not equal null, we're going to throw a new exception again. Let's clean this up a little bit. But then if we pass all of this validation, then we're going to hash the password, create the new user, create the new account, and insert that into the database. And then we should also return, I guess this return code doesn't actually matter because it's either going to be successful all the time or throw an exception. And now that I'm here, about to create this exception, I have decided that I don't want this to actually throw exceptions. What I want this to do is return a registration result, and that's going to be an enum. So we're not going to have to throw exceptions, we're just going to return a result that'll tell if there was an error or if it was successful. So let's go ahead and define that on our IAccountService Service interface up here. And of course we need to return that enum. And then we're going to create it right up here. Let's create that enum right here. Sorry if I say enum weird. I don't know if it's enum or enum. I always thought it was enum, but then people started calling it enum. So now I call it enum. But let's define that. And the results are going to be, of course, success. I guess passwords do not match, which is kind of a long name, but we can always change that. We'll have email already exists and username already exists. And I think that's actually all we need. So what we're going to do is create a registration result up here. Call it result. And by default, it's going to be success. And then let's return that at the end of this method. And now inside of all of these, instead of throwing exceptions, we are going to set the result. So if the passwords don't match, then the result is going to be passwords do not match. And then let's add that down here. So if the email already exists, then the result is going to be email already exists. And if the username already exists, then we will use username already exists. And then right down here, what we're going to do is if the result still equals success, then we are going to create the user inside of here, and then we're going to create and then just return this success. Except now it's called result. So let's change that. And there we go. So now we are just going to return this enum. We're not going to be throwing exceptions, which I think a lot of people will prefer. Because I've read that exceptions are expensive and you should really only throw them in exceptional situations. So is a failed registration really exceptional if, say, the passwords don't match? Not necessarily. We can check before we really throw an exception. But of course, that is kind of a blurred discussion. But we're going to go with result enums right here. So now for our login, what we're going to do is I think we are going to keep this as an exception, because we need to return this account from this method. And you could return, say, a login result object that has the account on it, and then also has if it was successful or not, and what kind of error occurred, like the passwords don't match. But I kind of want to keep this really simple and just return the account and throw exceptions if anything goes wrong. So the exception that we're going to throw, we're going to create up here in our domain, and we're going to call this invalid password exception. So let's create that. Extend exception. We're going to generate all the constructors, but I think I'm just going to get rid of this protected one. And then back on our authentication service, we're going to throw that invalid password exception. And I think in this exception, I'm going to pass in a username and a password. So the username and password that they tried to log in with, and then we're going to add those to this exception. just so that we can read it when we catch the exception, in case we want to use that in an error message, such as probably not the password that they use, but maybe the username. So we'll make properties for username and password. And then let's highlight those, and we can add those to all of our constructors. And there we go. Now all of our constructors set those properties, and we are successfully throwing this exception. And I think that is all we need to do for these login and register methods. They do seem pretty robust actually. We got our result objects, and we can really tell what's going on if a login or registration fails. So now that we have those, I think that's actually all we're going to do for those services, and that is actually where we're going to wrap up this episode. So we're not going to be testing out all of this authentication service in this episode, all of these different code paths for the exceptions and the results, because next episode we're actually going to be writing unit tests for our authentication service. So that's going to be very exciting. But other than that, if you guys have any questions, criticisms, or comments, be sure to leave them below in the comments section. But other than that, if you guys enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like or subscribe for more. Thank you.